Ethan Davis stood in the narrow aisle of Blue Wings Airlines Flight 231, his dark eyes scanning the first-class cabin of the Boeing 787 departing from San Francisco International Airport. The boarding pass in his hand, slightly creased from the frantic dash through security, clearly read Seat 1A. Yet there in his assigned window seat sat Margaret Hawthorne, a woman whose poised elegance and designer attire screamed wealth and entitlement. Ethan, dressed in a black hoodie, dark jeans, and sleek sneakers that cost more than most people's monthly rent, was no stranger to the subtle judgments that followed him in spaces like this. As the CEO of BrightPath Technologies, a tech company that owned 70% of Blue Wings Airlines, he was used to navigating rooms where his presence was questioned, his credentials, scrutinized, his very existence in elite spaces met with raised eyebrows. Today, though, he was tired, bone-deep exhausted from a week of pitching BrightPath's latest AI-driven reservation system to investors in Silicon Valley. All he wanted was to settle into his seat, sip a coffee, and prepare for the board meeting awaiting him in Miami. But as he stood there, boarding pass in hand, Margaret Hawthorne didn't even glance up from her phone, her manicured fingers scrolling through what looked like listings for multi-million-dollar beachfront properties in Malibu. "Excuse me, ma'am," Ethan said, his voice calm but firm, carrying the measured tone of someone who had learned to keep frustration in check. "You're in my seat. This is 1A. Margaret's head tilted slightly, her blue eyes flicking up to meet his for the briefest moment, before returning to her phone. "Oh, I'm sure there's been some mistake," she replied, her voice smooth as silk, but laced with a condescension that felt like a slap. "I always book 1A. I'm a Star Sapphire member with Blue Wings. Perhaps you could check with the flight attendant. I'm quite comfortable here." The word comfortable hung in the air, a deliberate marker of her claim to the space, as if Ethan's presence was an inconvenience she was too gracious to fully acknowledge. He felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the weight of being reduced to an outsider in a space he had every right to occupy. It wasn't just about the seat, it was about the assumption, the unspoken belief that someone like him, a black man in casual clothes, couldn't possibly belong in first class. Ethan took a deep breath, glancing at his boarding pass to confirm what he already knew. "Ms. Hawthorne," he said, reading her name from the designer luggage tag dangling from the bag at her feet. "My boarding pass clearly says 1A. I'd appreciate it if you could check yours and move to your assigned seat." Margaret finally set her phone down, her lips curling into a smile that was equal parts amusement and disdain. "My dear," she said, her tone dripping with the kind of patronizing sweetness that Ethan had heard countless times in boardrooms and country clubs, "I've been flying Blue Wings for 15 years. I know how these things work. There's obviously been a mix-up, and I'm sure the crew will sort it out. Why don't you find another seat? I'm sure there's something suitable for you." The word suitable was a knife sharp and precise, implying that his place was elsewhere, anywhere but here in the rarefied air of first class. The other passengers in the cabin were starting to notice. A few heads turned, their eyes darting between Ethan and Margaret, some curious, others uncomfortable, most pretending to be absorbed in their magazines or phones. Ethan caught the gaze of an older couple in row 3, Mr. and Mrs. Foster, their faces etched with a quiet recognition that suggested they'd seen this script play out before. Behind him, a man in a tailored blazer. James Miller adjusted the lens of a professional camera, subtly capturing the moment. In row 4, a young woman, Amy Chen, held her phone at an angle, her fingers moving quickly as she started a live stream on Instagram, her lips moving silently as she narrated the scene to her followers. Ethan could feel the weight of their attention, the unspoken tension that always accompanied these moments when race class and power collided in public. "Ma'am," Ethan said, his voice steady, but now carrying a faint edge, "I'm not interested in finding another seat. This is my assigned seat, and I'd like you to move." Margaret's smile faltered for a moment, her eyes narrowing, as she took in his casual attire again, lingering on his sneakers, as if they confirmed her assumptions about him. "Look," she said, leaning forward slightly, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone. "I don't know what you're trying to pull here, but this is first class, not, well, you know." She gestured vaguely, letting the implication hang in the air. Ethan's jaw tightened. He knew exactly what she meant, just as he'd known every time someone questioned his presence in a boardroom or a luxury hotel lobby. It was the same coded language that had followed him from his days at Stanford, through the launch of BrightPath Technologies, to the moment he became one of the youngest black CEOs in the Fortune 500. People like Margaret saw his skin, his clothes, his youth, and assumed he was out of place, an interloper in their world of privilege. "I'm not pulling anything," Ethan replied, his tone calm but unyielding. "I have a boarding pass for 1A. You don't. I'm asking you to move." Margaret's laugh was sharp, almost theatrical, drawing more eyes from the cabin. "Oh, please," she said loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Do you really think you belong here? I mean, look around. This isn't the kind of place where people dress like they're heading to a basketball game." The insult landed like a punch, and Ethan felt the familiar surge of anger, tempered by years of practice in keeping it contained. He glanced at his watch, a Patek Philippe, a quiet indulgence he'd allowed himself after BrightPath's IPO, but it was hidden beneath the sleeve of his hoodie, invisible to Margaret's judgmental gaze. In his backpack, slung over one shoulder, was a laptop containing contracts that could shift billions in market value emails that directed thousands of employees and algorithms that powered the operations of airlines across North America. But to Margaret Hawthorne, none of that mattered. To her, he was just a black man who didn't know his place. The cabin was now fully aware of the confrontation. James Miller, the man with the camera, had shifted to get a better angle, his lens discreetly trained on Margaret's face. Amy Chen's livestream was picking up steam, her viewer count climbing past 500 as comments flooded her screen. Ethan could see the glow of her phone, the rapid scroll of reactions, emojis, exclamations, and hashtags like #first-class-drama. The Foster couple in row 3 exchanged a look, the wife shaking her head slightly as if to say, "Not again." Ethan's phone buzzed in his pocket, likely his assistant Melissa Davis checking on his status. He ignored it for now, focusing on Margaret, who was still clutching her phone as if it were a shield. "Ms. Hawthorne," he said, his voice low, but carrying a new authority. "I'm going to ask you one more time to move. This is my seat, and I intend to sit in it." Margaret's eyes flashed with indignation. She wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone she clearly viewed as beneath her. "Young man," she said, her voice taking on a lecturing tone, "I'm Margaret Hawthorne of Hawthorne Properties. We develop luxury estates across the West Coast. I've been a Star Sapphire member for over a decade, and I specifically requested this seat. If there's been an error, it's not my fault, and I'm certainly not moving. I suggest you take this up with the airline staff." She pressed the call button above her head with a flourish, the chime echoing through the cabin like a summons to battle. Ethan stood his ground, his boarding pass still in hand, as the other passengers watched with bated breath. Some looked uncomfortable, others intrigued, and a few, like the man in row 2, who had been pretending to read a financial magazine, seemed to be siding with Margaret based solely on her polished appearance and confident demeanor. Ethan felt the weight of the moment, the way it distilled years of microaggressions into a single public standoff. He'd been here before in different forms, questioned by security guards in office buildings, mistaken for an intern at his own company's galas, asked to show ID in places where his white counterparts were waved through. But this was different. This was his airline, his seat, his moment to decide whether to let the script play out as it always had, or to rewrite it entirely. "Ma'am," he said, his voice now carrying a quiet intensity that made a few passengers lean forward. "I'm not confused about how things work. I know exactly what's happening here. You're assuming that because of how I look, I don't belong in this seat. You're wrong, and I'm not moving." Margaret's face flushed, her composure cracking for the first time. "How dare you?" she snapped, her voice rising. "I'm not assuming anything. I'm simply stating facts. I booked this seat, and I'm not giving it up because you think you can bully your way into first class." The word bully was a calculated jab designed to paint Ethan as the aggressor, and it worked on some level. Several passengers shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting to the flight attendant call light, as if hoping for rescue. Amy Chen's live stream was now at 1,000 viewers, her comments section exploding with reactions ranging from outrage to support. James Miller's camera clicked softly, capturing Margaret's expression as she leaned forward, her designer handbag, a territorial marker, on the seat beside her. "This is absurd," Margaret continued, her voice loud enough to carry to the back of the cabin. "I've flown this route dozens of times, and I've never had to deal with this kind of nonsense. You're making a scene for no reason." Ethan's phone buzzed again, but he kept his focus on Margaret. "The only scene here," he said, "is the one you're creating by refusing to move from a seat that isn't yours. Show me your boarding pass. If it says 1A, I'll gladly find another seat." Margaret's eyes widened clearly, unprepared for the challenge. She fumbled with her purse, pulling out a boarding pass and glancing at it quickly before shoving it back inside. "I don't need to show you anything," she said, her voice sharp. "I know my rights as a passenger. The airline will handle this." Ethan nodded slowly, recognizing the tactic. She didn't have the boarding pass for 1A, and she was banking on her status to override the rules. It was a power play, one he'd seen countless times in negotiations, but never so blatantly personal. The soft tread of regulation airline shoes announced the arrival of Sarah Lawrence, a flight attendant in her early 30s, with a practiced smile that barely masked her unease. Her dark hair was pulled into a neat bun, and her uniform was crisp, but her eyes betrayed the stress of dealing with what was clearly escalating beyond a routine seating dispute. "Good afternoon, Sarah," said her voice, carrying the trained cheer of someone accustomed to diffusing tension. "I understand there's some confusion about the seating. How can I assist?" Margaret immediately leaned forward, her demeanor shifting to one of aggrieved victimhood. "Thank you so much for coming," she said, her tone suddenly warm. "I'm Margaret Hawthorne, Star Sapphire member. There's been some kind of error with the seat assignments, and this gentleman is insisting I move from my seat. I've already settled in, and I'd appreciate it if you could resolve this quickly." Sarah turned to Ethan, her smile less warm but still professional. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass?" Ethan handed it over, watching as her eyes scanned the document. Her brow furrowed slightly as she confirmed the seat number, then glanced at Margaret, who was watching with a smug expression. "Well," Sarah said, her tone careful, "it does appear that seat 1A is assigned to you, Mr. Davis. However, Ms. Hawthorne is one of our most valued customers, and she's already settled in. Perhaps we could find you another seat in first class. I can offer you 2C, an aisle seat with excellent legroom." Ethan felt the familiar knot in his stomach, the one that formed whenever someone suggested he compromise to avoid rocking the boat. It was the same suggestion he'd heard in countless forms: be flexible, be reasonable, don't make a fuss. But flexibility, he'd learned, often meant sacrificing his own rights to preserve someone else's comfort. "I appreciate the offer," Ethan said, his voice steady but firm. but I'd like to sit in my assigned seat. The one I paid for. The one that's printed on my boarding pass." Sarah's smile faltered, and Margaret's expression hardened. "This is ridiculous," Margaret said, her voice loud enough to draw even more attention. "I've been flying with Blue Wings for years, and I've never been treated this way. If there's been a mistake, it's not my responsibility to fix it. I'm sure the airline can find a solution that works for everyone." The implication was clear: Ethan should be the one to move, because Margaret's status trumped his rights. Amy Chen's live stream was now at 2,000 viewers, her phone buzzing with notifications as the hashtag @BlueWingsDrama began to trend. James Miller adjusted his camera, zooming in on Ethan's calm but resolute expression. Ethan looked around the cabin, taking in the faces watching him, some sympathetic, some judgmental, most just waiting to see how this would play out. He could feel the weight of history in this moment, the way it echoed every time he'd been asked to prove he belonged, to justify his presence, to make himself smaller, so others could feel bigger. His phone buzzed again, and this time he glanced at it. A text from Melissa, flight delay board meeting prep. "Ready. Need you in Miami by noon." Ethan typed a quick reply. "Delayed. Handling situation. Will update." He slipped the phone back into his pocket and looked at Sarah. "I'd like to speak with the captain," he said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made several passengers sit up straighter. "This isn't about finding a solution that works for everyone. This is about respecting my rights as a passenger." Margaret's laugh was sharp, almost desperate. "The captain, really, you're escalating this over a seat. This is why people like you—" She stopped herself, but the words hung in the air, unfinished but unmistakable. Ethan's eyes narrowed. "People like me," he repeated, his voice low and dangerous. "Finish that sentence, Ms. Hawthorne. I'd love to hear what you mean by that." The cabin fell silent, the tension thick enough to choke on. Amy's live stream hit 3,000 viewers, and James Miller's camera clicked again, capturing the moment that would soon define the entire flight. Sarah, clearly out of her depth, nodded quickly. "I'll get Captain Lawson," she said, hurrying toward the cockpit. Ethan stood his ground, his boarding pass still in hand, knowing that whatever happened next would change everything, not just for him but for everyone watching, and for an industry that had no idea what was coming. The first-class cabin of Blue Wings Airlines Flight 231 was charged with tension as Ethan Davis stood resolute in the aisle, his boarding pass for Seat 1A gripped tightly in his hand. Margaret Hawthorne, still occupying his rightful window seat, had just pressed the call button again, her face a mask of indignation as she awaited the captain's arrival to resolve what she believed was a simple misunderstanding in her favor. The other passengers, no longer feigning disinterest, watched the standoff with a mix of curiosity and discomfort. James Miller, the freelance journalist in row 2, adjusted his camera lens, capturing every nuance of the confrontation. While Amy Chen's Instagram livestream had surged past 3,500 viewers, her phone buzzing with comments and hashtags like #BlueWingsDrama and #FirstClassJustice. The older couple in row 3, Mr. and Mrs. Foster, exchanged knowing glances, their weathered faces reflecting a lifetime of navigating similar slights. Ethan felt the weight of their gazes, the unspoken solidarity of those who'd been told they didn't belong, but he also felt the weight of his own power, a power Margaret Hawthorne and the airline crew had no idea they were challenging. Ethan's phone buzzed again in his pocket, likely another message from his assistant, Melissa Davis, but he kept his focus on Margaret, whose smug smile suggested she was certain the captain would side with her. "You're making this far more complicated than it needs to be," Margaret said, her voice carrying the polished arrogance of someone accustomed to getting her way. "I've flown Blue Wings for 15 years, and I've never had to deal with this kind of disruption. The captain will sort this out, and I'm sure you'll find a seat that's more appropriate for you." The word appropriate was a deliberate jab, a coded reminder that in her eyes Ethan's presence in first class was an anomaly, a glitch in the system of privilege she navigated so effortlessly. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. Years of high-stakes negotiations at Bright Path Technologies having taught him the value of staying calm under pressure. "Ms. Hawthorne," he said, his voice low but firm, "the only thing inappropriate here is you sitting in a seat that doesn't belong to you. Show me your boarding pass or move." Margaret's eyes flashed with irritation, but before she could respond, the soft click of polished shoes on the carpeted aisle announced the arrival of Captain Peter Lawson. He was a man in his late 50s. His graying hair neatly combed his uniform crisp with the authority of decades in the cockpit. His expression was one of practiced neutrality, the kind of look pilots used when dealing with everything from turbulence to passenger disputes. Behind him trailed Sarah Lawrence, the flight attendant, her earlier confidence replaced by a nervous glance between Ethan and Margaret. "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen," Captain Lawson said, his voice smooth and commanding, designed to restore order. "I understand there's a seating issue. Let's see if we can resolve this quickly so we can get underway to Miami." He turned to Margaret, first his demeanor softening slightly as he recognized her star sapphire pin, a marker of her elite status with the airline. "Ms. Hawthorne, I believe you're involved." Margaret seized the opportunity, her tone shifting to one of gracious victimhood. "Captain Lawson, thank you for coming," she said, extending a manicured hand as if greeting an old friend. "I'm Margaret Hawthorne, Star Sapphire member for over a decade. There's been some sort of error with the seat assignments, and this gentleman is insisting I move from my seat. I've already settled in, and I specifically requested 1A for my connecting flight in Miami. I'd appreciate your assistance in resolving this." Her words were polished, her smile calculated, but Ethan caught the flicker of triumph in her eyes, as if she believed the captain's authority would naturally align with her privilege. Captain Lawson nodded, then turned to Ethan, his expression professional but noticeably cooler. "Sir, may I see your boarding pass?" Ethan handed it over without a word, watching as the captain examined it, his brow furrowing as he confirmed the seat number. "Well," Lawson said, handing the pass back, "it does appear that seat 1A is assigned to you, Mr. Davis. However, Ms. Hawthorne is one of our most valued customers, and she's already settled in. We have other excellent seats available in First Class 2C, for example, is an aisle seat with ample legroom. I'm sure we can find a solution that works for everyone." The suggestion hung in the air like a verdict, and Ethan felt the familiar sting of being asked to compromise, to be the one to bend, so that someone else's comfort could be preserved. The cabin was now a stage, every passenger a spectator. Amy Chen's live stream had hit 5,000 viewers, her comments section, a chaotic mix of outrage, support, and speculation. James Miller's camera clicked softly, capturing the captain's diplomatic smile and Margaret's triumphant nod. The Foster couple in row 3 leaned forward, the husband muttering something to his wife that Ethan couldn't hear, but could guess something about how this always happened, how fairness always seemed to bend toward wealth and whiteness. Ethan's phone buzzed again, and he glanced at it briefly. A text from Melissa, board meeting rescheduled to 3 p.m. "Everything okay? Social media's blowing up about your flight." Ethan typed a quick reply. "Not okay? Handling it. Prep the board for a major announcement." He slipped the phone back into his pocket and looked at Captain Lawson. "With all due respect, Captain," he said, his voice calm but carrying a steel edge, "I'm not interested in a solution that involves me giving up my seat. I paid for 1A. It's mine. I'd like Ms. Hawthorne to move." Margaret's laugh was sharp, almost incredulous. "This is absurd," she said, her voice loud enough to carry to the back of the cabin. "Captain, I've been flying Blue Wings for years. I know the crew, I know the procedures, and I know my rights. If there's been an overbooking or a computer error, that's not my problem. I'm not moving." She leaned back in the seat, crossing her arms as if to physically claim at her designer handbag, a territorial marker on the seat beside her. Sarah Lawrence shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting to the captain for guidance. Captain Lawson raised a hand, signaling for calm. "Mr. Davis," he said, his tone still diplomatic but firm. "I understand your position, but sometimes these situations require a bit of flexibility. Ms. Hawthorne has a connecting flight, and she's a long-time customer. We can make this right for you with another seat and some additional amenities, perhaps priority service or a complimentary upgrade on your next flight." Ethan felt the familiar knot in his stomach tighten. This was the script he'd seen play out countless times. The black man asked to be reasonable, to be accommodating, to swallow the indignity so the system could keep running smoothly. He glanced at Amy Chen, whose phone was still trained on the scene, her viewer count now at 7,000. James Miller had shifted to a better angle, his camera capturing the captain's expression as he waited for Ethan's response. The Foster couple in row 3 were no longer whispering. The wife was openly shaking her head, her lips pressed into a thin line. Ethan looked back at Captain Lawson, his decision crystallizing. "Captain," he said, his voice quiet but commanding, "I'm not moving, and neither is this plane, until this situation is resolved properly." The cabin fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Margaret's eyes widened, her composure cracking. "You can't be serious," she said, her voice rising with a mix of anger and disbelief. "You're holding up an entire flight over a seat. Do you have any idea how ridiculous you sound?" Ethan didn't flinch. "What's ridiculous," he said, "is that you think you can take my seat, refuse to show your boarding pass, and then accuse me of causing a scene. This isn't about a seat anymore. It's about respect." Amy's live stream hit 10,000 viewers, the comments section erupting with hashtags like Blue Wings Justice and Stand Your Ground. James Miller lowered his camera for a moment, his eyes meeting Ethan's with a look of quiet respect, as if recognizing that something bigger was unfolding. Captain Lawson's radio crackled to life. A voice from the cockpit breaking the silence. "Captain, we're ready to push back, but we're getting reports of a social media situation involving our flight. Ground control wants to know what's happening." Lawson's expression tightened, and he turned to Ethan, his diplomatic tone giving way to a hint of frustration. "Mr. Davis, passengers don't have the authority to delay a flight. I'm trying to resolve this amicably, but if you insist on escalating, we may need to involve security." The threat was subtle but clear, and Ethan felt the eyes of every passenger on him waiting to see how he would respond. Margaret leaned forward, sensing an opening. "Exactly," she said. "Captain, I've been more than patient. This man is clearly trying to make a scene for attention or some kind of compensation. I've seen this before. Let security handle it." The word compensation hit Ethan like a spark to dry tinder. It was the same accusation he'd heard in different forms throughout his career, that his success, his presence, his very right to exist in elite spaces was somehow fraudulent, a product of charity or manipulation rather than merit. He looked at Margaret, then at Captain Lawson, then at the passengers who were now openly watching their phones and cameras, documenting every moment. Amy's live stream was at 12,000 viewers, and the Foster couple had started recording on their own phone, their faces set with determination. Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, his movements deliberate. "Captain?" he said, his voice carrying a new authority that made everyone in the cabin pay attention. "Before you call security, I suggest you listen very carefully to what I'm about to do." He opened an app on his phone, one that none of the passengers recognized, a sleek interface with the Blue Wings Airlines logo and a series of operational controls labeled Bright Path Technologies Executive Dashboard. Ethan's finger hovered over a button marked Ground Flight, CEO Override. "This," he said, holding the phone up so Sarah and the captain could see, "is the executive control panel for Blue Wings Airlines operations. And this is what happens when someone pushes me too far." He tapped the button, and the app processed for a moment before displaying a confirmation: Flight 231 grounded by owner directive. Return to gate immediately. Almost instantly, Captain Lawson's radio crackled again. "Flight 231, this is Tower Control. We're showing a CEO override order to ground your flight. Please confirm status and taxi back to gate B12. The cabin erupted in murmurs, passengers exchanging shocked glances. Margaret's face drained of color, her earlier confidence replaced by confusion. What did you just do?" she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan pocketed his phone and looked at her, his expression calm but unyielding. "Ms. Hawthorne," he said, "allow me to introduce myself properly. I'm Ethan Davis, CEO of Bright Path Technologies, which owns 70% of Blue Wings Airlines. In other words, I don't just have a seat on this plane, I own the plane." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the low hum of the aircraft's systems and the rapid clicking of James Miller's camera. Amy's live stream hit 15,000 viewers, her comments section exploding with reactions. "He owns the airline. This is iconic. Blue Wings." Justice, Captain Lawson stared at his radio, then at Ethan, his professional demeanor crumbling as he processed the implications. Sarah Lawrence looked like she might faint, her hands trembling as she clutched her clipboard. The Foster couple in row 3 broke into quiet applause, the husband nodding approvingly. James Miller lowered his camera, a grin spreading across his face, as he realized he'd just captured the story of a lifetime. Margaret, for the first time, seemed to shrink in her seat, her designer handbag no longer a shield but a reminder of her miscalculation. You can't be serious," she said, her voice shaking. "This is some kind of joke, right? You're not—" She trailed off, unable to reconcile the man in the hoodie with the idea of a CEO who could ground an entire flight. Ethan didn't respond immediately. He looked around the cabin, taking in the faces of the passengers, some shocked, some embarrassed, some openly cheering. Amy Chen was narrating furiously to her live stream, her voice trembling with excitement. "Guys, you're not going to believe this. The guy they tried to kick out of first class owns the airline. This is history happening right now." James Miller approached cautiously, his press badge now visible. "Mr. Davis," he said, his voice professional, but tinged with awe. "I'm James Miller, freelance journalist. I've been documenting this. Would you care to comment on what just happened?" Ethan shook his head slightly. "Not yet, Mr. Miller, but you'll get your story soon enough." The aircraft began to move, taxiing back to gate B12 as per the tower's instructions. Through the windows, Ethan could see ground crew preparing to reconnect the jet bridge, their faces puzzled by the unexpected return. His phone buzzed again, this time with a call from Melissa. He answered, keeping his voice low. "Ethan, what the hell is going on?" Melissa's voice was frantic. "Social media is exploding. #Blue Wings Justice is trending, and I'm getting calls from CNN and MSNBC. Did you really ground the flight?" Ethan glanced at Margaret, who was now staring at her hands, her earlier bravado gone. "Yes," he said simply. "Prep the communications team. This is going to be big, and get me a meeting with the board as soon as we land." He ended the call and looked at Captain Lawson, who was still processing the situation. "Captain Ethan said I suggest you inform your crew that we'll be deplaning temporarily, and I'd like to speak with you and Ms. Lawrence privately once we're at the gate." As the plane came to a stop at Gate B12, the cabin was abuzz with whispers and the glow of phone screens. Amy's live stream had climbed to 20,000 viewers, and James Miller was already typing notes on his phone, likely drafting the story that would dominate headlines by morning. Margaret Hawthorne sat frozen in seat 1A, her face pale, her hands clutching her purse, as if it could anchor her in the storm she'd unwittingly unleashed. Ethan stood tall in the aisle, his hoodie and sneakers a stark contrast to the power he'd just revealed. The passengers watched him with a mix of awe and curiosity, sensing that they were witnessing the start of something monumental. Through the window, Ethan could see a small crowd gathering at the gate. Reporters, airline executives, and curious onlookers, all drawn by the viral story unfolding in real time. This wasn't just about a seat anymore. It was about a reckoning, and Ethan Davis was ready to lead it. Gate B12 at San Francisco International Airport was a whirlwind of activity, as Blue Wings Airlines Flight 231 returned unexpectedly grounded by Ethan Davis, the CEO of BrightPath Technologies and majority owner of the airline. Ethan stood just outside the aircraft door, his black hoodie and jeans a stark contrast to the immense power he'd just wielded. The first-class cabin behind him was still reeling from his revelation. The man they'd tried to push out of seat 1A was not just a passenger, but the owner of 70% of Blue Wings Airlines. Margaret Hawthorne, still seated in 1A, looked like a statue, her earlier arrogance replaced by a pale, stunned silence as she clutched her designer handbag. The other passengers were deplaning slowly, their phones glowing with notifications, as Amy Chen's Instagram live stream hit 25,000 viewers, the hashtag #BlueWingsJustice trending worldwide. James Miller, the freelance journalist, was already on his phone, pitching the story to major outlets, his camera slung over his shoulder, after capturing the moment that had turned a routine flight into a global news event. Ethan's phone buzzed relentlessly in his pocket, but he ignored it. For now, his eyes scanning the growing crowd at the gate, reporters, airline executives, and curious onlookers drawn by the viral firestorm. As Ethan stepped onto the jet bridge, he was met by Melissa Davis, his assistant, her tablet glowing with a flurry of notifications. "Ethan," she said, her voice a mix of urgency and awe, "this is everywhere. CNN wants you for a live interview in 10 minutes. The Washington Post and the New York Times are here, and #BlueWingsJustice is the #1 trend on Twitter. What do you want to do?" Ethan took a deep breath, his mind racing, but calm the way it always did before a high-stakes negotiation. He'd spent years building BrightPath Technologies into a tech powerhouse, its reservation software running 75% of North America's airlines. But this moment was different. This wasn't about contracts or market share. It was about using the platform he'd been given to confront a systemic wrong. "Get me on that CNN call," he said, "and tell the board to expect a full briefing within the hour. This isn't just about our airline anymore." The gate area was a circus. Reporters jostled for position, their cameras flashing, as Ethan emerged flanked by Melissa and a nervous-looking Blue Wings executive, Claire Hawthorne, no relation to Margaret, the airline's VP of operations. Claire's face was pale, her hands clutching a clipboard as she whispered urgently into a phone, presumably reporting to the board about the grounded flight. James Miller pushed through the crowd, his press badge swinging as he held up his phone. "Mr. Davis," he called James Miller, freelance journalist. "Can I get a statement on why you grounded the flight?" Amy Chen was right behind him, her live stream now at 30,000 viewers. Her voice steady as she narrated to her followers, "This is unreal, guys. The CEO just grounded his own plane because of discrimination. We're at the gate now, and the media's going crazy." The foster couple from row 3 stood nearby, their faces a mix of pride and disbelief, the wife still recording on her phone as if to ensure the truth wouldn't be buried. Ethan raised a hand for silence, his presence commanding the chaotic scene. "I'll make a statement shortly," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had made him a legend in tech boardrooms. "But first, I need to address something with Blue Wings' leadership." He turned to Claire Hawthorne, who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. "Miss Hawthorne," he said, "effective immediately, Captain Peter Lawson and Sarah Lawrence are suspended, pending a full investigation into their handling of this incident. I also want a comprehensive report on every discrimination complaint filed against Blue Wings in the past 5 years on my desk by Monday. And I'm ordering the development of a mandatory anti-bias training program for all customer-facing staff to be implemented within 60 days. Claire's mouth opened, then closed, her professional composure cracking under the weight of Ethan's directives. "Mr. Davis," she stammered, "there are union protocols, and the timeline change the protocols." Ethan interrupted, his tone unyielding. "This isn't a negotiation. This is about accountability." The crowd murmured, cameras flashing as reporters scribbled notes. Amy's live stream hit 40,000 viewers, her comments section a torrent of support. "This man is a hero. Finally, someone's holding airlines accountable." Blue Wings Justice James Miller was typing furiously, his story already taking shape. Melissa handed Ethan a phone, whispering, "CNN's ready for you. It's Jake Tapper." Ethan nodded, stepping to the side of the gate area as the crowd parted, their phones and cameras tracking his every move. "This is Ethan Davis," he said into the phone, his voice steady as Jake Tapper's familiar baritone came through. "Mr. Davis, thanks for joining us. We're live on CNN and the world is watching what's happening at SFO. Can you tell us exactly what led to you grounding Blue Wings Flight 231? Ethan glanced at the crowd, his eyes meeting James Miller's for a moment, before settling on Amy, whose phone was still streaming. "What happened," he said, "is that I was treated like an intruder in my own airline's first-class cabin. Ms. Margaret Hawthorne took my assigned seat 1A and refused to move despite having no boarding pass for it. She suggested I didn't belong in first class, implied I was running some kind of scam, and used language that made it clear her assumptions were based on my race and appearance. When I insisted on my rights, the flight attendant, Sarah Lawrence, and Captain Peter Lawson suggested I move to another seat to keep the peace, despite my legitimate claim to 1A. That's when I used my authority as the majority owner of Blue Wings to ground the flight." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, even though many had witnessed the moment on the plane. Hearing it laid out so clearly on live television made the stakes feel monumental. Jake Tapper's voice carried a note of astonishment. "You're saying you grounded your own airline's flight to make a point about discrimination?" Ethan nodded, though Tapper couldn't see it. "I grounded the flight to make a point about justice." He said, "This wasn't just about me. It's about every passenger who's been told they don't belong because of their skin color, their clothes, or their background. It's about an industry that's been allowed to treat discrimination as a customer service issue instead of a civil rights violation." Amy's live stream hit 50,000 viewers, her comments section, now a global conversation with viewers sharing their own stories of airline discrimination in languages from Spanish to Mandarin. Claire Hawthorne stepped forward, her face a mix of desperation and professionalism. "Mr. Davis, she said loud enough for the reporters to hear, Blue Wings takes these allegations very seriously. We're prepared to conduct a full investigation and implement any necessary changes. Ethan turned to her, his expression hard. Ms. Hawthorne, your airline received 1,237 discrimination complaints last year alone, according to BrightPath Technologies data. Fewer than 3% were escalated beyond initial customer service responses. 0 resulted in meaningful action. An investigation isn't enough. I'm demanding systemic change starting now. The crowd fell silent, stunned by the numbers. James Miller was scribbling furiously, his story now guaranteed to dominate front pages. Amy's live stream hit 60,000 viewers, and the hashtag @BlueWingsJustice was trending alongside #systemic change. A young man in a hoodie approached Ethan, weaving through the crowd with a laptop bag slung over his shoulder. Mr. Davis, he said, his voice nervous but determined. I'm Lucas Nguyen, a computer science student at UC Berkeley. I've been following your work with BrightPath Technologies, and I have an idea for an AI algorithm that could analyze crew behavior data to detect patterns of bias in real time. I sent you a proposal on LinkedIn last week. Ethan's eyes lit up, recognizing the kind of innovative thinking that had built his company. Lucas, he said, I haven't seen your proposal yet, but I want you on a call with my team tomorrow. If your algorithm is viable, we'll integrate it into our systems. Lucas's face broke into a grin, and Amy turned her phone to capture the moment, her viewers cheering the unexpected collaboration. This is what change looks like, guys, she said to her audience. A student just pitched an idea to the CEO, and he's listening. Jake Tapper's voice came through the phone again. Mr. Davis, you're talking about systemic change. Can you elaborate on what that looks like? Are you planning to use your ownership of Blue Wings to force policy changes across the industry? Ethan looked around the gate area, taking in the faces watching him, reporters, passengers, airline staff, and Lucas Nguyen, whose proposal had just sparked a new idea. BrightPath Technologies powers the reservation and passenger management systems for 75% of North America's airlines, he said. Starting today, we're integrating a real-time bias detection and reporting system into our software. Every discrimination complaint will be automatically escalated to corporate executives with mandatory response times. Every pattern of biased behavior will trigger immediate intervention. Airlines won't be able to bury these incidents anymore because the data will be transparent and accessible to passengers. The crowd erupted in murmurs, cameras flashing, as reporters scrambled to capture the announcement. Claire Hawthorne's face went white, her clipboard trembling in her hands. Mr. Davis, she said, her voice strained, that kind of change could disrupt operations across the industry. There are contracts, regulations. Ethan cut her off. There are also laws against discrimination, Ms. Hawthorne. And there are passengers who deserve better than being asked to compromise their rights to preserve someone else's comfort. If airlines want to keep using BrightPath's software, they'll comply with these new standards. If not, they can spend years and billions replacing our systems. The implications hit like a shockwave. BrightPath's near monopoly on airline software meant Ethan could effectively force industry-wide change, and everyone in the gate area knew it. Margaret Hawthorne emerged from the jet bridge. Her designer clothes rumpled, her makeup streaked with tears. She approached Ethan, her voice barely audible. Mr. Davis, I didn't know who you were. I'm so sorry. Can we resolve this privately? Ethan looked at her, his expression softening, but not yielding. Ms. Hawthorne, he said, this was never about who I am. It's about how you treated me when you thought I was no one. You assumed I didn't belong because of my race and my clothes. You accused me of causing a scene for standing up for my rights. This isn't a private matter. It's a public one, and it's going to be handled publicly." Margaret's face crumpled and she turned away, disappearing into the crowd as reporters shouted questions after her. Amy's live stream was now at 80,000 viewers. Her comments section, a flood of stories from passengers who'd faced similar treatment. James Miller stepped closer, his notepad open. "Mr. Davis, you've just announced a technological revolution in how airlines handle discrimination. Are you prepared for the pushback from an industry that's notoriously resistant to change?" Ethan nodded, his eyes steady. "I've been fighting resistance my whole career, Mr. Miller. The difference now is that I have the leverage to make change happen, and I'm not backing down." Melissa handed him her tablet showing a graph of Blue Wings' stock price, which was down 15% in after-hours trading, while BrightPath Technologies' shares were up 10%. Investors betting on Ethan's bold leadership. A new figure pushed through the crowd. A woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and a press badge, identifying her as Isabella Duncan, a senior reporter for the San Francisco Chronicle. "Mr. Davis," she called Isabella Duncan Chronicle. "Your actions today are making waves, but some are calling this a publicity stunt. How do you respond to that?" Ethan's expression didn't waver. "Ms. Duncan, if I wanted publicity, I'd have called a press conference, not grounded a flight. This is about accountability. I was treated like a criminal for daring to sit in my assigned seat. That's not a stunt. It's a systemic failure, and I'm using my platform to fix it." The crowd murmured in approval, and Amy's live stream hit 100,000 viewers, her voice trembling with excitement. "This is history, guys. He's changing the game right now." Ethan's phone buzzed with a text from Lucas. "Nguyen, thank you for the opportunity. I'm ready to join your team." Ethan smiled faintly, typing a quick reply. "Welcome aboard. Meeting tomorrow at 9 a.m. He looked up to see the foster couple approaching, the wife's eyes shining with tears. "Mr. Davis," she said, her voice soft but firm. "We've been flying for 40 years, and we've seen what you went through too many times. Thank you for standing up. Not just for you, but for all of us." Ethan nodded, his throat tightening. "Thank you," he said. "This is for everyone who's been told they don't belong." As the CN call wrapped up, Jake Tapper's voice came through one last time. "Mr. Davis, we're out of time, but can you confirm if you'll be in our New York studio tomorrow to discuss this further?" Ethan glanced at Melissa, who gave a quick nod. "I'll be there," he said, "and I'll have a full plan for how we're going to make sure no passenger ever faces what I did today." The call ended, and the gate area erupted in applause, led by the foster couple, and joined by passengers, reporters, and even a few airport staff. Claire Hawthorne was on her phone again, her voice frantic as she reported Ethan's demands to the board. Amy Chen turned her phone to face herself, her eyes wide with excitement. "Guys, this is bigger than one flight. This is about changing how airlines treat people. Share this stream, use Shod Blue Wings. Justice, and let's keep this going." Ethan looked out at the crowd, the weight of the moment settling on him. He'd started the day wanting nothing more than a quiet flight to Miami, but now he was at the center of a movement. BrightPath Technologies' software. His software was about to become a weapon against discrimination, and the world was watching. As the reporters closed in, their questions overlapping, Ethan knew this was just the beginning. The industry he'd helped build was about to face a reckoning, and he was ready to lead it. 2 years had passed since the incident on Blue Wings Airlines Flight 231 at San Francisco International Airport, and Ethan Davis found himself once again boarding the same route to Miami, settling into seat 1A, the very seat that had sparked a global reckoning. The first-class cabin was quieter now, not just in sound, but in spirit, as if the airline itself had absorbed the lessons of that day. Ethan, still dressed in his signature black hoodie and jeans, no longer drew curious glances or raised eyebrows. His Patek Philippe watch remained hidden beneath his sleeve, a private reminder of his journey from a Stanford undergrad to the CEO of BrightPath Technologies, a company that had reshaped the airline industry and beyond. As he stowed his backpack, he noticed the small screens embedded in the seatbacks, each displaying the words "Dignity for All," alongside a QR code linking to Blue Wing's real-time discrimination reporting system. The cabin crew moved with a new kind of confidence, their training in anti-bias protocols evident in their warm, equitable greetings to every passenger regardless of appearance or status. The world outside the aircraft had transformed profoundly. The incident that began with Margaret Hawthorne refusing to vacate Ethan's seat had ignited a movement that extended far beyond Gate B12. BrightPath Technologies' bias detection software, now integrated into 80% of North America's airline reservation systems, had processed millions of passenger interactions, flagging thousands of potential bias incidents and ensuring complaints were escalated and resolved within 24 hours. The data was staggering. In the past year alone, discrimination complaints across the industry had dropped by 40%. Not because passengers were complaining less, but because airline staff, aware of the transparent monitoring, were more conscious of their actions. Ethan's phone buzzed with a notification from BrightPath's Civil Rights Division: 2.7 million interactions analyzed in the last 24 hours, 312 incidents flagged, 104 complaints resolved. The numbers were a testament to the systemic change he'd demanded, but they were only part of the story. As the plane taxied toward the runway, Ethan opened his laptop to review notes for the Global Technology and Justice Summit in Miami, where he was set to announce the expansion of BrightPath's anti-bias systems into healthcare, education, and housing. His inbox was flooded with messages of support. A note from James Miller, now a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist for his coverage of the airline discrimination movement. A video from Amy Chen, who had parlayed her viral live stream into a career as a civil rights documentary filmmaker, and a message from Lucas Nguyen, the UC Berkeley student whose AI algorithm had become a cornerstone of BrightPath's bias detection technology. Lucas was now a lead engineer at BrightPath, working on systems that identified patterns of discrimination in real time across multiple industries. Ethan smiled as he read Lucas's message, "Ready for the summit. Our new healthcare module is live. It's catching biases in patient triage already. Thanks for believing in me." The flight attendant, Sarah Lawrence, approached Ethan's seat, her uniform now adorned with a badge identifying her as Director of Inclusive Customer Experience. After the incident 2 years ago, Sarah had undergone intensive retraining and emerged as a vocal advocate for systemic change within Blue Wings. Her presence on this flight was no accident. The airline had scheduled her for Flight 231 as a symbol of its transformation. "Mr. Davis," she said, her voice warm but professional, "welcome aboard. It's an honor to have you with us today." Ethan nodded, his earlier frustration with her replaced by respect for her growth. "Thank you, Sarah," he said. "You're doing important work." She smiled, a flicker of pride in her eyes, before continuing down the aisle to assist other passengers. As the safety announcement began, Sarah's voice came over the intercom, clear and confident. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Blue Wings Airlines Flight 231 to Miami. Before we take off, I'd like to remind you that this airline is committed to ensuring every passenger travels with dignity and respect, regardless of background or appearance. 2 years ago, This very flight was the site of an incident that sparked a global movement for equity in air travel. Today, thanks to the courage of one passenger and the technology that makes accountability possible, we're proud to lead the industry in creating a more inclusive experience for all. The announcement drew quiet nods from passengers, some of whom glanced at Ethan, recognizing him from the news coverage that had dominated headlines for months. Across the aisle, a young girl no older than 10 tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mom," she said, her voice carrying in the quiet cabin. "What does dignity for all mean?" Her mother, a black woman in her 30s with a warm smile, leaned down. "It means everyone deserves to be treated fairly, Lily. It means no one can make you feel less than because of who you are." Ethan overheard the exchange, his heart swelling with a quiet pride. This was the real measure of success, not the awards, the stock prices, or the international recognition, but the fact that a child could board a plane and feel safe, knowing her dignity was protected. The conversation reminded him why he'd fought so hard that day at Gate B12. Ethan's phone buzzed again this time with a text from Isabella Duncan, the San Francisco Chronicle reporter who had covered the original incident. "Mr. Davis, the UN just adopted your bias detection framework as a global standard for transportation equity. Congratulations. Can I get a quote for tomorrow's story?" Ethan typed a quick reply, "This is a victory for every passenger who's ever been treated as less than." The work continues. He sent the message and leaned back in his seat, reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. 2 years ago, he'd been just a passenger trying to sit in his assigned seat, only to face the familiar sting of discrimination. Now, he was a global leader in civil rights technology, his company's systems transforming industries far beyond aviation. The plane lifted off the San Francisco skyline, fading into the distance, as Flight 231 climbed toward Miami. Ethan glanced at the seatback screen, which now displayed real-time data from BrightPath's bias detection system, a graph showing a steady decline in discriminatory incidents across Blue Wings' flights, alongside testimonials from passengers who'd used the reporting system to resolve issues quickly and fairly. One testimonial from a passenger named Mary Clarkson read, "I was profiled at check-in because of my headscarf. I scanned the QR code, filed a complaint, and within hours, the airline apologized and retrained the staff. Thank you, Blue Wings, for listening." Ethan's eyes lingered on the words, a reminder that the technology he'd built wasn't just about data, it was about people. A soft tap on his shoulder drew his attention. The girl across the aisle. Lily Carter was looking at him, her eyes wide with curiosity. "Mister," she said, "are you the one who made the screens?" Her mother looked embarrassed, but Ethan smiled. "Something like that," he said. "I helped make sure everyone gets treated the same when they fly." Lily's face lit up. "That's cool. My teacher says fairness is the most important thing in the world." Ethan nodded, his throat tightening. "Your teacher's right, Lily. Fairness is why we do this." Her mother leaned over, her voice soft. "Thank you, Mr. Davis. My family's been flying for years, and it's never felt like this before. We feel seen." Ethan met her eyes, recognizing the weight of her words. "You're welcome," he said, "and you'll always be seen from now on." As the flight continued, Ethan opened his laptop to finalize his summit speech. The Global Technology and Justice Summit was expecting over 5,000 attendees, including policymakers, tech leaders, and civil rights advocates from 60 countries. His keynote would unveil BrightPath's new initiatives, AI-driven bias detection for hospital patient intake processes, predictive models to identify discriminatory practices in school discipline, and blockchain-based transparency tools for housing applications. The systems were already in pilot phases, with early data showing a 25% reduction in biased patient triage and a 30% drop in disproportionate suspensions in schools. Ethan's vision, born from a single moment of injustice, was reshaping how the world thought about fairness. His phone buzzed with a video from Amy Chen, now a celebrated filmmaker whose documentary Flight for Justice had won awards at Sundance. The video showed her at a screening addressing a packed theater. 2 years ago, I live-streamed a moment that changed my life, she said. Ethan Davis showed us that one person's courage backed by the right technology can rewrite the rules. Share this story. Keep pushing for justice. Ethan forwarded the video to Melissa with a note, "Amplify this. Let's get Amy on the summit panel." He then opened a message from James Miller, who had just published a book about the airline discrimination movement. Your work inspired a generation, Ethan. The book's dedicated to you. The plane began its descent into Miami, and Sarah Lawrence's voice came over the intercom again. Ladies and gentlemen, as we prepare to land, I want to thank you for choosing Blue Wings Airlines. Our commitment to dignity and respect is more than a slogan. It's a promise we keep every day, thanks to passengers who refuse to accept less than they deserve. The words were directed at everyone, but Ethan felt their weight, a reminder of the responsibility he'd taken on. As the plane touched down, he looked out the window at the Miami skyline, knowing that the summit tomorrow would mark the next chapter in a movement that had started with a single seat. At the gate, Ethan was met by a small group of BrightPath employees, including Lucas Nguyen, who held a prototype tablet displaying the latest version of their bias detection software. Mr. Davis. Lucas said, his voice brimming with excitement, "We've integrated sentiment analysis into the healthcare module. It's catching microaggressions in doctor-patient interactions with 92% accuracy." Ethan clapped him on the shoulder. "That's game-changing, Lucas. Let's showcase it tomorrow." As they walked toward the terminal, Ethan noticed a group of students waiting near the gate, their signs reading, "Dignity for all and thank you, Ethan." One of them, a young black woman named Chloe Martin, stepped forward. "Mr. Davis, I'm studying civil rights law at Howard, inspired by what you did. Your tech is why I'm pursuing a career in justice advocacy." Ethan shook her hand, his heart full. "Chloe, keep pushing. The world needs people like you." The lesson of Flight 231 was clear, and Ethan articulated it in his mind as he prepared for the summit power, whether it's a CEO's authority, a student's algorithm, or a passenger's voice is only as valuable as the purpose it serves. What happened 2 years ago wasn't about revenge. It was about responsibility. When Ethan grounded that flight, he wasn't just standing up for himself. He was standing up for every person who'd been told they didn't belong, every child, like Lily Carter, who deserved to grow up in a world where fairness wasn't negotiable. Technology, he'd learned, could amplify justice or entrench injustice depending on who wielded it. By embedding accountability into the systems that powered daily life, he'd turned a moment of personal indignity into a global movement for equity. As Ethan stepped into the Miami terminal, he glanced at his phone, now displaying a notification from the White House. The Digital Civil Rights Act, inspired by BrightPath's work, would be signed into law next week. But his eyes were drawn to Lily Carter, who was waving from the jet bridge, her mother snapping a photo. "That's the man who made the screens," Lily called, her voice echoing with pride. Ethan waved back, knowing that the real legacy of Flight 231 wasn't in the laws or the algorithms, but in the simple truth that one person's courage could change the world, one seat, one story, one step at a time. The revolution that began with a grounded flight was now soaring, and Ethan Davis, the man who just wanted to sit in 1A, was its architect, proving that dignity wasn't a privilege, it was a right, and it was worth fighting for.